Hello, everyone. Today in this talk, I will be covering Cucumber, test automation, and salads. So Cucumber, I mean by the framework of test automation where you can write Gherkin syntax in order to write your test automation. So some test engineers, just like cats, have specific reaction to cucumbers, and they kind of dislike it because, well, it was promised that we could just copy paste your old manual test cases into automation, into Cucumber, and it would just magically work. But it didn't happen. And I get that there was like expectations and reality mismatching. And that's why there's such a big, I don't know, drawback from like the whole Cucumber thing. So regarding my disclaimer, so I'm not a fan of Cucumber. I don't get any like money. I don't get a compensation if you start using Cucumber. I'm just an engineer who's finding out the tools and like trying something new. And like my honest opinion is like it's just a framework. It have its benefit, have its drawbacks. It's not perfect for all the situations, so you need to like be mindful when you're using that. But still, I do have a background in Gherkin. And I started with Calabash. There was like my era in experience for a Calabash, then for SpecFlow, and then lastly with the protractor. So the Calabash one, it was used for mobile test automation. So we had a native application both in iOS and Android, and we used that Calabash to automate both of them. We actually connected them to the testing devices, like the actual iPhone and Android, and had Mac Mini on the table where it was connected to, as a Team City job like agent, which will running all the jobs. And whenever you had whenever we had new build, it would be running, and you would get the like feedback from actual device if the test cases are passing or not. But it didn't last long, and we needed to switch to like priority change, and we needed to switch another project. So then I went to the SpecFlow, and it was already running for multiple years, and we had a like test automation built in that. So I had an expectation, like a vision that the Cucumber, it's used that like that you have a step. Like I click on some kind of button and it's a variable. So basically use one step and you just change variables and it would be working. So underwater, you just like switch one or another locator. But in this one, it wasn't the case. There was a lot of different step definition for different situations. So there were like 20 ways you can click a button. And whenever you were writing the feature file, you would have to choose one of them, and you didn't even know if it would be working, because maybe something is specific to one page, which are like you're working a different one, it wouldn't work. So you end up writing a new one instead of like reusing something. So I didn't like that implementation, and I always thought it could be better. And when we got the new project, which was written in AngularJS, and we wanted to write automation for it from scratch, we used Protractor. And it was like 4 or 5 years, 6 years ago, I think, when Protractor was actually still supported. So, and this is the fully realized Gherkin project that I think that we went. We went to the place where we like really liked the implementation of Gherkin. It was actually helping us more than it was like obstructing or adding additional overhead. But to be honest, it was at the beginning, it was a BDD type, like business analyst, project managers, all were using BDD, and designers as well, to describe the behavior, and we use that as requirements, and then implementation happened, and we write the test automation at the end. But unfortunately, after a few months, everyone just decided, like, it's just too much, and we want to switch back to normal, simple requirements where everyone's like used to. But with automation, we still decided to keep on going and continue building our framework in Cucumber and creating this like Gherkin syntax just for automation, even though it might not be the best option, but we just wanted to continue with our framework. From the beginning, we had a main goal to make it maximize its reusability. We wanted to have fewer steps available, so we would know which one we need to use, and we would know that step would be working as we expect. And we created, I think there was 2 functions how you can click a button. One of them just would be just a click a button, and it would work in any page. We just give them a variable. And another function for clicking buttons where something I think in a table, you could select specific row by specific name, and then that row had multiple buttons assigned to that, so you can interact with them. So only two ways you can interact with the buttons. And every time when you thought that I need to write a new step definition in order to make an action, you should ask, you would have to ask yourself, is it possible to do something with already existing ones, so you wouldn't have to create a new one. So we ended up with having quite clean approach. Like when you had to write feature files with scenarios, those steps were really easy to pick up because you knew that there is only one way to click a button. So you knew how to, what you need to write, what kind of variables you need to pass to it, and it would be working. Because we had only few step definition, our maintenance was kind of low. There wasn't a lot of code to be working with, and if you want to refactor how the buttons are being clicked, you just have one function to deal with. Well, two in our case, but still it's not that much. But on the downside, those implementation of these steps had to be really flexible. We needed to know, to support clicking with the same function, clicking hyperlinks, clicking buttons, tabs, menus, drop downs. All of them had to be supported with only one function. So it was quite flexible. So just as a statistics, so after 3 years working on that project, we had 12,500 test steps in our scenarios. This is excluding all the examples. And examples is where you have, above the scenario, you have some kind of a table with the variables, and it would rerun the same scenario multiple times with different variables. So 12,500 is excluding all the examples, and only 53 step definitions. So it's on average, it was 237 times. So if you have a step definition, it would be probably used in 237 different places, different buttons, different drop-downs, different fields. So it was quite a good achievement, and we tried to keep that number, that 53, to the minimum. We didn't want to add anything else on top of that. Even that 53 number, it still includes take screenshot, debugging, pauses, also some kind of specific legacy part of the system, which we knew that we wouldn't change anytime soon, but we still needed the coverage for that in order to push it through to the production. So it's 10 of those are still used only once or twice, even maybe not even in runtime. So the actual median would be around 500. So if you take the middle ground, it's quite oftenly used. So we have step definition 500 times. It's used in our test cases. Just as a comparison to the previous spec flow implementation we had, it was only 3,500 steps in all the feature files, and 175 step definitions. So it's almost four times more steps for 4 times less of a scenarios, the steps in the scenario. So it's 16 times more complex. It's harder to maintain. It's more step definitions to work. It's harder to refactor, and it's bigger data code base to maintain. And on average, it was only 19 times used each scenario. So very reusable. So you might be wondering, how does this magical step definitions, which could support 237 different cases, would look like? So we can deep dive into a few of those. One of them is simple, just click on the button. So you get the name for a button you want to click. So for example, I click on login button, and then the type of the button. It could be button, checkbox, tab, card, row, hyperlink, whatever. And then you pass it as a variables. And then the click button function is getting those variables and passing into it. So this actual step definition doesn't have no logic. It just extracts the variables and just pass it to another function. So we try to keep this layer to the minimum, the bare bones of what we need in order to separate the Gherkin and the code. So the code would be cleaner without any kind of a Gherkin text in it. Similar example with I should see some kind of field, a specific field. So in this case, we went and we take the field name, and the matching type, like as, like strict matching, starting with, containing, more than, and then the text we want to like find in that field. So we take those variables and we then pass it to another function. Again, nothing much logical happening in this implementation for step definitions. For functions, it's kind of a similar, like it's still not very overly complicated. In this case, we get the button name. So it might be a login button, and we ask, like pass it this as a variable to the element parser. An element parser is some kind of a like a database. You get the query for what kind of like text of a button you want to get, and it always returns you the element, the locator you can like start working with. So that button is now like something that you can click, you can view, you can like use any kind of functions available as an element, and you can basically just click it. And also, if a start is failing, we want to have some kind of informative error message. Another example, a little bit more complex. So I should see something in the dropdown. And again, we're using element parser, and we like give it to the dropdown name, and it gives us the dropdown. So we can like check the all options, which contains the value we're seeking in that dropdown, and we get the count of that. If the count is expected, then it's fine. If not, again, we are writing quite informative error message. So in this case, like I expected to see 7 of toilet paper, but found 0, something that we can relate in pandemic, right? So it would be more informative. And we wanted to push for this information because every time when you go for a failed test case report, every time when you need to go inside the code, debug, run it, check out the latest version, because you get only like, I expected to see true, but I received false. Like it's not informative enough. So we had an unwritten rule. So every time when you see this kind of like feedback in your test report, you had to go and add normal message in order for you never to go back into the code and like read and find what's. So you need to pinpoint what exactly is not working, so you don't have to do that debugging. And over 3 years of investment, that was really great return on investment, because we didn't spend a lot of time writing this, but it helped us along the way each day when we had to maybe look at the flaky test, maybe look at the actual failures to make sure that what's not working. So let's get back to this magical database of element parser. How does it work? So we use some sort of vocabulary. So we have a text which is mapped to the specific location you need to return if you like search for that text. And we were using switch. So why switch specifically? So it had pretty great readability. So you have these cases, they're all aligned, they're like aligned, all this text, and easy to find, easy to read, find the locators you want to have. And additionally, it also had a search for duplicates. If you had a duplicate case, it would be marked for you like you already have this this element in this database. So you need to either rename it or reuse the previous one. Also, we could have used else if, and every time like if the room name like drop down name is a room name, then do something. So we could use that, but that ifs are really like there's could be a lot of human error if you add something additionally, like if the room name is like drop down name is room name and the environment is QA, then do that. Because of that complexity, you can have some kind of human error, because those files, those vocabularies at the end of our project, it was really huge, like 1,000 lines of actual locators for you to use. So you want to reduce the complexity because we knew that those files going to be huge. Also, if you wanted to add something else, how it works is just basically you sanitize the string, you want to lowercase them, then you go through the list, each of the case, oh, I found the room inventory, this is what I was searching for, and you return the locator. And it's still using page object model, resolve everything like an orders page, and you just return specific element to it. But there's like a mapping for vocabulary, which text is mapped to which locator. And it's really like allows you to move away from all the Gherkin inside the code itself in the code base. So you basically have feature files, maybe something in step definitions, and only in vocabulary is just Gherkin. Everywhere else is just the plain code, just like a normal, like any kind of like other programming language. So We also used quite extensive error messages. If we didn't find something, we're like saying that this drop-down name is not yet defined. Also, if they're after sanitization, we did some like trimming, maybe lowercasing, and if the value is changing from what we received, we're also saying that after sanitization, this is a new value, maybe something like mismatching with what you're searching or what you have in the vocabulary. So what we end up with is a database which can be used by multiple functions. So for example, if I have a field like username, if I add that field to the vocabulary, because all the functions, all the steps are using the same vocabularies, it will be available in all instances. I can immediately, if I add that to vocabulary, from a test case, from a Gherkin, I can assert it if it's visible, get the value of it, enter text to that, it would be working from beginning. So there's not much need to go and add something in the code. Additional improvements we made were page detection. So we ended up having a lot of specific cases. For example, the status was repeating in multiple pages. We had one for user status, one for item, order status, event, a lot of them. So in order to keep the text to the minimum, we added functionality like another built-in nested switch inside of it. And based on the page you're currently on in your automation, it would return one or another element. And it was kind of like saved us a lot of time from debugging. Also, it was from code perspective, it was quite minimalistic disruption. And from test case perspective, if we would add instead of status like user status, all of those cases would be like bigger lines of that readable text, and sometimes a bit too much to read. So if you can keep them to the minimum, it would be more readable as like documentation or scenarios if like someone else is reading them. Another improvement we made were with injected locators. Now I'm thinking that maybe like injections are a bit controversial topic, so probably I should have changed this picture. Sorry. Anyway, so injecting locators is a method when you can tag something in DOM so you can use it and find it easily with test automation. So for example, you can add data attribute like data minus end to end, and then some kind of like a text which you would use to find that element. So in order to avoid using chained elements like parent of some parent of other element. So in order to avoid that, you can just tag elements in DOM, and then when that version is deployed to some kind of environment, you can start using that instead of like finding out the best way to chain elements in order to get the specific element you want. But we use it a little bit differently. So for example, if you have a view page and you have an edit page, like username is the same kind of like, from functional perspective, it could be the same field, but in one case it would be a list like li item, or in another one input. But if I would tag them with that specific locator, same way, I could use that from page object model and also from my Gherkin vocabulary. I can use them as the same element, because functionally it is the same element. It's still a name I want to assert, maybe enter, and in the case I can tag them in both way, similarly, and I would just save some time, some space on lines of code, and I can interact with them. Doesn't matter if it's a view or edit page. Maybe if it's a view and I would try to enter text to it, it wouldn't work. But that would probably happen only when I'm developing test cases. It wouldn't happen when I actually have running a regression testing. So it actually saved a lot of time and was really convenient for us to tag similar elements and just group them together and just use them as a one. So quite an interesting approach. Another thing that we did was used placeholder for all the ordinal numbers. So as an example, we ended up using a lot of test data. So it was like first test event. We knew that in the first one you had some kind of like it's canceled. In a second event, it was empty, and the third one had some items in it. So in order to support them with our vocabulary, we needed to add each case for each of them. But what we could have what we come up with is that sanitizing string was removing all these ordinal numbers like first, second, third, whatever. It was just placing a placeholder instead of them. So if I have a first event overview, like I need to navigate to a first event overview page or second or third, I would still get to this specific line, to this specific case. And what it would do instead, it would just extract that like index of that what I want to find. First is 0, second is 1, third is like 2, and so on. So I extract that, and then I pass it to that specific function. And that function just basically appends specific ID to URL so we can navigate to that specific event page. And it was quite a clear and clean implementation. Like, if you have a new event you want to use for testing, you basically just add a new object here, like in this array, like number 9 and ID, some kind of like a new ID of the event you want to use. And that would be available for you from the like feature file. If you can start immediately writing, I want to navigate to the 3rd or 9th event page. So it was quite clean and interesting, but we also use this for interacting with specific rows in some kind of a table. So we could use the first, second, third row, or last row. Last was also supported, and it would just work the same way. We just sanitize, remove which row we want to interact with, and just pass it to the function. And we just come up with an answer which index you want to actually interact with. We also had to solve a small problem with like first name, last name, third-party vendor. It's not, it wasn't supposed to be like extracted as like what index of them we want to interact with. So those had to be like added to like exclusions, like what we like exceptions. So they wouldn't be like extracted from that. So, but it still worked. Just like we needed to find out the solution to do that. And the last improvement we made were the page and component objects. So we made kind of a hybrid of that. If you would follow page object step by step, you would have to, for each of the page, like web page, you had to create a page object. But we found out that there's some elements like navigation bar is, well, repeating for each of the page. So should they have, should they be in each of the page? Like menu bars, maybe some kind of forms, modules? Probably not. So we extracted them to the components. It was still called component object, and it had some like save buttons, cancel buttons, and were used for just a few elements like navigation bar, modules, warnings, and forms. So, but it actually saved us a lot of time because those have been changing in the past. So we had to only change it in one place instead of using it in and going to each of the page where they had some kind of interaction with navigation bar. So instead of that, you can only change it in one place and it will be working. So just as a summary, there might be an expectation that if you're using Gherkin and you're using non-Gherkin automation, the non-Gherkin one would be kind of a linear. Like over time, the complexity will grow, but it will be just as you expect. With Gherkin, it will be just always an overhead. It would be the same way if you would just writing test automation with non-Gherkin, but the extra layer of features, supporting feature files, would be always an overhead. Sometimes it's even worse when you just start running into like bottlenecks or feature file, because if you have step definition and it's already used and you want to create a new one, you might be blocked because, well, it's already used and you want a new one. You want a new way to click a button. You will need to, I don't know, to come up with something more creative in order to add another step definition. So they would be like existing in the same namespace with different names. And what we ended up with, I think it's at some point we just stopped growing complexity. So if we would need to add like twice more test cases, up to 25,000 test cases, like test steps, I don't think the complexity would grow a lot. We already have a lot of steps defined. The only thing that would grow is like feature files. Well, it's expected because more test cases would mean more feature files created or more scenarios created. Also, vocabularies would grow because you would need to interact with different elements, and new page objects would be created for new pages you want to like increase the coverage on. But the code itself wouldn't grow. It would just stop. The complexity would just stop at some place, and we could expand and expand, create more and more. It would be, the volume would increase, but the complexity would stay the same because we only had a little of a coding part. But the other parts, like the modular approach to the vocabularies, allows us to scale much higher, with more efficient and more leaner, compared to like if we would be using it in like would create more step definition for each occasion. So I think it was quite an interesting challenge, and how we actually managed to solve that as a team. And just a quick summary, what we went through today. So maximizing reusability. This is true for both Gherkin and non-Gherkin implementation. If you can reuse some kind of helpers, functions, which you already have in your framework, do so. Try to minimize how much you create for each of the occasion, because you will have to maintain them later on. So try to reuse, make it more flexible to fit both cases which you want to cover, and that would leave you with less maintenance in the long run. Informative error messages is a good in the return on investment. If you invest that early on, you might save yourself a long time, because if you're gonna check the report from automation each day, and like we had a really long period where we had flake test, but after some time we fixed them. It was quite stable until new Chrome version released, and then it started becoming flaky again. So, and after a while, Protractor wasn't even supported. So yeah, this happened as well. But at the beginning, it was really informative. Like it was easier for anyone checking those reports from what failed, what went wrong. It was much easier for them to understand what's not working. And vocabularies are something probably can use only in non-Gherkin implementation, but you can try it in Gherkin implementation, but you can try to use it in non-Gherkin one. I would be surprised if you could, but maybe. But it's easier way to map text from Gherkin to locator you want to return for that one, and just centralize it into one place. All of the fields are being being parsed by one entity, and just you could give them a name and they give you back the locator, and all the functions are using a same way to get that locators. It's really is saving a lot of time. Then some workarounds is that page detection might help you minimizing the variables, like how much of the text you need to use in order to specifically match specific text to the locator. And then injecting locators is helpful not only for Gherkin but non-Gherkin as well, because you can easily save yourself a lot of time, because UI might be changing, and if you like connect it to div or specific classes which are used for like display properties for those elements, it might change. But if you add something concrete to that, it will help you in long run without like a lot of needing a lot of maintenance if UI changes. And ordinal numbers is something you might use it in your implementation as well. There might be occasions where you're using ordinal numbers. And page component is that you don't have to follow blindly page object model, because sometimes it does create duplicates. But if you can do some kind of a hybrid for page and component objects, and that could save you some time as well. And that's it. Thank you for listening, and I hope this presentation did not encourage you to use Cucumber, because Cucumber is a great framework, but it's best used in a situation when you using BDD in the old project, and everyone starting from project managers and business analysts and designers using that language, and you can reuse that in your automation. That's fine. If you need a living documentation and clients or stakeholders are reading from them and they need that as a proof, that's also a great source to do that. But anything else, it might be not the best place to use that. So be mindful when you use it. But what I hope this presentation actually did is inspired you to maybe seek out other ways to do automation, to do problem solving. If you see a problem, if you see a solution and you don't agree with that, you think that maybe there is another way, try it. At least do a POC, try it, and maybe you will come up with a new solution which you can share with everyone else. So I think I hope it inspired you to maybe seek out and do something that might not be according to Stack Overflow, or some guide on the internet. So maybe any questions?
that was great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so it's interesting, Cucumber, right? Like there's some really great things there. And as somebody who, while I still consider myself a tester, I'm technically a product owner now. I appreciate Gherkin a lot. Um, but yeah, there's some stuff with Cucumber that isn't perfect. So I want to flip over and get to some questions, and then we can chat some more. So we have a question that came in. He said, "Great session. Can you please elaborate on injecting locators in tests? How can we add locators to the DOM while writing tests?"
Yeah, well, you need to use the actual application you're developing. So you need to have that repository checked out, and you need to add those locators to the repository. Maybe like how we did, like if we have a new page, we want to like inject locators so we can easily find them when doing automation. So we agreed with developers how we're gonna do that. They said that we can use a class variable like attribute, and but our locators have to start with end-to-end minus, and then any name we want to choose for that locator. But we didn't want to do attribute of like data minus end-to-end. I'm not sure why, but this was the agreement. And every time when we change and add locators to the DOM, like we find it in the code where that page is, then we find HTML or whatever like format you're using, find that element and add the additional attribute or additional class, and then create a pull request and ask some front-end engineers or any developer just to code review our changes, and then they will merged into the repository of the application. And the next time it's deployed, or if you testing locally, you can just check out the latest version, build it, and run it, and it will be there all the time from now on. So yeah, that's. I hope it answered how actually to do that.
I think so. Makes sense. We have another question that came in. Let's see. Daniel would like to know if you could elaborate more on the idea of scenario and Cucumber testing.
Uh, in Cucumber, there's feature files, and there are like features, which you basically like just to compare it with something like we have in in Jest or Mocha, I think. They're like describe, and there is it statements. So describe is a feature. You can describe what you want to, like what this feature file is testing, and the scenario is it statement. So like scenario could be, it should block if a user if he enters incorrect password 3 times in a row. So that's a scenario you were like kind of testing. So it's basically just a syntax how you can write this, like test cases for Cucumber.
Makes sense. Let's see. Where can Daniel go to look for more information if he wants to get a little bit deeper in that?
I think the Cucumber IO maybe, or Cucumber, just the Google Cucumber automation framework, just not just any Cucumber. So any Cucumber automation framework would give you some kind of a detail and explanation, maybe even guide how to start up the automation. How we used, were like we had the protractor, so the runner, the like executor was a protractor, but we added a plugin to support Gherkin, and it was like Cucumber for protractor, something like that. But it's not supported anymore. Like protractor is like a dead tool for a few years now. So like I'm not recommending to use that. But I think a lot of modern tools have like a plugins for to support Cucumber, and probably just in Cucumber IO page you would find quite a big extensive list of tools and guides.
Okay, awesome. Wasn't sure if there was like a source that you preferred over others, because there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of it is bad. So it
Yeah.
always helps to get referred to something.
Yeah, I haven't been using that tool for I think 3 years now. So I'm like nowadays I'm using more like just the situation happens that in projects there's no like no one is like in projects I'm in, no one is using BDD or no one is requiring any live documentation, living documentation. So there's just no point in using Cucumber. So I'm a bit outdated on that topic. What's the
Okay,
latest?
makes sense. Makes sense. So I'm curious, what are you working on now? Like, is there something you're really interested in, something you're experimenting with?
Uh, yeah, good question. So right now, we did work on test automation project. I helped build in the like initial framework where we were using an unit and WebDriver to control it, and it was like a plain one without any like additional fancy functions. So it was a bit hard to go from Puppeteer and Cypress and the Playwright and go into like plain WebDriver without any like kind of like helping functions. But it was like something that the like client we were working on like asked us to do, so they could support it. And yeah, it was a really like oh boy, was it hard to find for page to load, for elements to be visible, and you needed to create that logic, all the helper functions from a bottom, like from scratch. And in order to get to that like perfect level of stability, it took a while. So yeah, that was an interesting challenge from like which you always think like there's new more modern frameworks you can use and avoid this kind of hassle. It's just like sad that you need to scratch, but it's an experience as well because
Yeah.
you know how it's actually working, and I think it's like it's still building like adding to your suitcase for like what you can do.
Yeah. So Daniel's got a follow-up question. Because he is now learning about BDD, which of course goes hand in hand with Cucumber. So he wants to know a little bit more about BDD, and of course, like Daniel, just so you know, yeah, there's only so many hours in the day. So I think Nikolaj can give you some background on BDD, but BDD is a huge topic.
Yeah, it is. Uh, yeah, um, I can probably talk about the specific implementation we had and the idea behind it. So we had a table of like of the steps or like actions you can perform and some variables we're supporting, and we asked everyone to be aligned with the way we write those BDD scenarios, and and by using that we had easier time to just import them into our automation. And we actually, well, we needed still to add some steps in between. Sometimes it's like if you want to click to some kind of as a user, you just click on that menu. As a like automation perspective, you need to expand the kebab menu first to click on it, and then you have the menu items. So so yeah, there were some actions like you needed to add, but it was easier for us not to change a lot of text. So we aligned with how we write, and we had to share a lot of feedback from developers to sharing to like business analysts how they read this like behaviors. But I know that the designers really loved using that. It was easy for them to use that language to explain behavior of the animation or how it should be behaved. So instead of like writing or recording some kind of a sophisticated like a GIF or like a mock-up for how its animation should be behaving, they could just write the like using Gherkin syntax with like transparencies in 1 second. It becomes transparent, like 50% transparent in 0.2 seconds. It just like totally transparent and so on. So that's really useful for them how to explain with stats with like easy to recreate steps, and then developers could easily implement that. So yeah, this is what we were using. One of the examples we also like encouraged to use BDD more is we investigated how the unit tests are being written. And as usual, the unit tests were written in a matter like you know how the code is working, and you basically go to look at the code and you write unit tests to verify the code is working. And you sometimes forget to verify what it actually does, like what the user is getting from it. And we encourage them to use more about to use behavior driven development in the unit test itself. So like writing scenario names more like what's the behavior I'm actually testing, instead of like a method name or function name and just like test that like function. So it was more useful and uncovered more of the problems we had when like implementation wasn't aligned with with the requirements. And by doing unit testing on the implementation and looking only on the implementation, you wouldn't notice that. So yeah, it added some value in there, but it was like really small proof of concept, like how to use that. So, but yeah, it's related to them.
And there's a couple of things you touched on that, if it's okay, I kind of want to expand on,
Sure.
um, because I feel like the way we talk about BDD is a little bit limiting to the power of what BDD really is, because it's not just a means of kind of communicating. It's a whole culture. So when we're doing BDD as a team, because this is something that the entire development team needs to do. Testers need to be on board with it. Developers have to be on board with it. The product owners or business analysts need to be using it. The designers need to be using it. We shift from talking about what an application does to talking about what the user values, and designing and building and delivering code based on what they value. Um, and then we start building out all of our tests, including our unit tests and our automated tests and our manual tests, based on what the user really values. Um, there is a there's a huge amount of power in BDD that I think gets glanced over and missed, and I think it gets missed because everybody associates it so strongly with Cucumber, instead of seeing it as its own distinct, um, not an action, but culture. And so when you take something like test-driven development and you write really meaningful unit tests based on what you understand about the code you're going to write, and then you add in building tests based on what you understand about what the customer values, now you've shifted from a code delivery culture to a customer value culture. And I could talk about this for hours, which is why I'm going to stop myself. But I think that we make it too small when it can be this really big, powerful thing. But I'm going to stop myself because we could wind up here for 3 hours talking about this.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Like, I do notice that sometimes we are switching to like implementation details too much without thinking like what's the value behind that. Like, do we need to do that? And it's just sometimes it's it's a bit disappointing that the like priorities are not being like assigned by the value, more about what like different things in like impact our priorities rather than the value and like what user would get from that. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And like I never been in the project where like like BDD was so much in like a part of the like not a part of a culture, but like the idea behind everything, starting from requirements and starting from user stories. So but it sounds really interesting. I wish I could try it out. It sounds really powerful, as I said. Yeah.
I think it's a perfect world kind of thing, right? Like it's a once in a lifetime opportunity that you're going to get to like work in that kind of culture. But I
Yeah.
want to shift. Oh, sorry. I want to shift because Anna has a question. What are the advantages of Cucumber? She said, it seems cool, but what are the advantages kind of in a nutshell?
Yeah, so mostly, mostly, mostly like advertised for is that the living documentation is that if you read the test case, like the scenarios, the steps, and it's passing, that means that this is actually what's working. And if it's working, that means that you can, I don't know, try to use that as a functionality. Maybe it's still like, if you would be only the code, that means only developers or test engineers, anyone who's like with technical knowledge to read the code could read the scenarios of actually what's happening, how the functions are working. If you have the BDD in place, like in Gherkin, it's test feature files written in Gherkin, that means that anyone can read them. If they're like written in a human readable manner, like if you don't use class names inside inside the feature files to target the elements, but you're using actual readable like login button instead of like btn minus login minus something something, just very specific class name to target, that would be more readable. And even from business perspective, or even from UAT perspective, I could read out the latest feature files developed, and I would know what I will get in this release, and I know how to use them, how to invoke them. So that's one of the biggest advantages, as well, in my opinion. Another one would be if the framework is how. In our example, like the framework was quite easy to maintain. So basically, if you want to write new test cases, you don't need to do a lot of coding. What you need to do is ability to write feature files, to know how to add new elements inside the vocabulary. So it's basically new case with some kind of like link to the element inside the page object model, and also add a new element inside the page object model. So basically a name and some kind of locator. So there is not much of the complexity, and like the learning curve is quite small in order for you to, if the framework is already built out. So learning curve is quite small to use to start using the Gherkin, compared if it's all written in code and it might be not very maintainable and like hard to read. Not always, but sometimes it is. So yeah, I think those might be the two values. Maybe probably there's more. Forget about them.
Somebody commented something that's really true, which is that one of the big values we get out of Gherkin and Cucumber is that it's in plain text. That so much of this is really readable and understandable, which enables your manual testers and your business folks to get more engaged, which in turn lightens your load because they're doing some of this too, which is super helpful.
Like one of the things that I had troubles with, then you get on a project which is already like running, and you have a manual test case, just in simple steps, and you start performing it, and you notice that it wasn't maintained and doesn't work, and you don't know how to actually that feature is working. You don't know how to actually make sure that it's still functioning. And with that living documentation, if the tests are failing, that means you need to maintain those scenarios. That means that it's like outdated. So if it's always green, if it's always working, those are more up to date, not deprecated and still maintained scenarios. So it's a really big value if you like value those kind of things in your project.
I agree. Awesome. Thank you. Well, any final thoughts before we send people back to their day?
That's final thoughts from me, right? Not
yes.
from...
Yes, final thoughts from you.
I think like there was a point in my career that when I was using Cucumber, and there was like a really big like I wouldn't like really big negative feedback about it, and I at some point I was kind of not curious, but kind of ashamed that I was like writing in Gherkin. And I think that was like a small portion of my career, but like there was a year or so when I was like what automation using? Just like not automation, just like So, but I hope like right now, if you're using that and if you're using it properly and it's benefit you, like I hope it will, like you won't be like ashamed that you're using that, because I think it's a great tool, and it's like I think you need to celebrate that what it achieved, because I think it accelerated the whole adoption of test automation, because at some point everyone thought like it's so easy to start automating, and I think a lot of people jumped on board, started their automation, but thought like maybe there's better ways to do that, and just steer towards more like code only automation. And I think it really did a great impact to automation and to testing, and I want to celebrate that.
I agree. It really was a more meaningful entryway into automation than Selenium capture and playback, than some of the really early like spreadsheet kind of driven tools. Like, what is it, data driven and keyword driven. Like, when we got to Gherkin, we grew up a little bit as far as like automation that doesn't require a CS degree.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. That talk was wonderful. I really enjoyed our chat. I'm glad we were able to get everybody's questions answered. And thank you so much for joining us today. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day, whether it's the afternoon or the morning for you. But I hope the rest of the day is great for everybody. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.